Welcome, everybody. It's so wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation's um, first conversation of 2025. And I am so grateful that you're with us. If anybody wants to put up in the chat where it is that they're zooming in from, it's always wonderful to see that we often have people from across the country and sometimes other parts of the world. So thank you all for being here. My name is Susan Barber, and I have the wonderful opportunity um, to offer community education, conversations with authors who write in the death, dying, loss, and grief space. And this morning we have Kelly Cervantes with us. So for those of you who don't know about the foundation, um, I just want to say that we're a 501(c)(3) foundation that was founded by Ken Ross, who is Elisabeth Kübler-Ross's son. He is still managing the foundation. And Elisabeth was a psychiatrist, a humanitarian, and a hospice pioneer. And she often, almost always, is described as the deaf and dying lady. But for those of you who would ever have had a chance, I was very fortunate to meet Elisabeth before she died. And I will tell you, she was the life and living lady. There was not an opportunity for living her life that she did not explore. And for her, death was just a natural part of living a full life. And that has been her approach. That was her approach as a doctor, psychiatrist, and in the spirit of embracing all of life, which includes death. This foundation is here to further the mission of Elisabeth. Um, Ken operates amazing chapters all over the world: Guatemala, Japan, France. They are doing incredible work with palliative care programs, supporting a pediatric palliative care program that's underway and being built out in Peru. So supporting the foundation supports people in the US and other parts of the world. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. And Elisabeth, I think the thing that she held most close to her heart was the idea that unconditional love heals, and unconditional love heals people. And whether your illness can be cured or not, love and healing is always available. So in that spirit, we're going to offer this conversation this morning. I'm going to do sort of the formal introduction, then I'll do the introduction in terms of the reason I asked Kelly to join us today. So Kelly Cervantes is an award-winning writer, a speaker, and advocate, best known for her blog Inchstones, where she shares the stress, love, and joy that came from parenting a medically fragile and complex daughter, Adelaide. Since Adelaide's death, just 5 days before her fourth birthday in October of 2019, Kelly has continued to write candidly about the arduous and at times contradictory grief journey. We'll talk today about her book, Normal Broken, The Grief Companion, for when it's time to heal, but you're not sure you want to. And I love that title so much. Um, I was so fortunate to meet Kelly at an event that happens each November. This year it was in LA, called Endwell, that convenes a group of people from lots of different disciplines to think about how we can rethink about a lot of these traditional ideas we have about death, dying, loss, and grief. And I was telling Kelly earlier, I saw her immediately when I arrived. She was just had this beautiful energy. Was beautifully dressed. Just there, and then she and her husband Miguel sat down right in front of me and my colleagues. And um, I was just curious about what their story is and why they're here. And then they got up on the stage and told the story of why they were there and why they were speaking. And oh, Megan, thank you. Or Megan, she also loved your outfit. She was at Edwell too. And though I rarely want to, I rarely do actually comment on people's appearance, Kelly you just really stood out there. And so um, the story that she and her husband gave us was just so incredible. And I spoke with Kelly afterwards and asked if she would be willing to join us. And she immediately said yes. So Kelly, I'm going to put the spotlight on you here. Well, actually, that will happen when you just start speaking. For those of you, if anybody is still new to Zoom after these last 5 years, up in the upper right corner of your screen, for most screens, there'll be something called View. And if you pull that down, you can click on Speaker, and then whoever is speaking will be highlighted. We are recording this. It will go up on the YouTube channel as soon as Ken Ross gets a chance to put it there. And for those of you just joining us, please do feel free to put up in the chat where it is you're zooming in from. There'll be Kelly will be giving a talk, and then we'll have Q&A. For those of you that might be shy about asking a question in a Zoom that will be on YouTube, feel free to put your comments or questions, anything you'd like on the chat. I'll be following that, and I can ask Kelly those questions if you'd like me to ask her. I encourage all of you, though, if you have something to say or something you'd like to share, to please feel free to do that at probably 45 minutes in. So Kelly, why don't you go ahead and continue introducing yourself, and I will put myself on mute now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Susan, for that beautiful introduction. When Susan asked me to participate in this Zoom chat, it was an immediate yes. What an iconic woman, an iconic organization, and unfortunately, fortunately, grief has become such a central focus of my life, and one of the areas that I have become extraordinarily passionate about. I do want to preface this that I am amazingly home alone currently, which is incredible. However, that also means that my two dogs, Tabasco and Sriracha, are currently on either side of me. And if there is any sound outside of my house, one will go nuts and then the other will follow. So apologies if I have to take like 30 seconds to calm them down or anything like that. So you are forewarned, my spicy dogs. So I have had two prophetic dreams in my life. Seems like a good place to start. The first was that I owned this awesome pair of yellow galoshes that like went right up to my knees, and they laced up and they were so freaking cute. And then I realized that that one was probably just manifesting because I went out and bought them. But the second prophetic dream that I had was that I was pregnant with a ladybug. And that might be alarming to someone if they weren't actually pregnant at the time. Conveniently, I was. I think, like many mothers to be, when I found out I was having a little girl, I had long had the name picked out. My husband, while we conferred on my older son Jackson's name, there was no conference on my daughter's name. That had been solidified since I was about 12 years old. Her name is Adelaide, and perhaps there was meaning in that I already knew that her name was Adelaide, that I had a dream about ladybugs. Adelaide quickly became my Adeladybug. Adelaide was the name of my great-grandmother, and while I never met her, the stories that I was told about her always struck me. Aside from Adelaide just being a beautiful name, this woman was remarkably strong during the Great Depression. She moved her family from New Jersey to New York City, where she could take a job working for a wealthy family on the Upper East Side, but the family would not allow her to bring her young children with her. So she found a home for her eldest son to go to, but could not find someone to take in her young daughter, my grandmother. And she ended up putting her in an orphanage in Harlem, and would visit her on the weekends. And then, unfortunately, my great-grandmother passed away when my grandmother was a teenager. But I often think of my great-grandmother Adelaide and the strength that it must have taken her to make such a challenging decision to separate her children, to separate herself from her children. She could have said, "No, I'm not going to do that. I need to keep my children with me." And they could have been in a tenement or in a soup kitchen line, but she made this remarkable decision to try and give her children a better life, and she did. Um, but that story has always stuck with me. And I think that more than an ounce of my great-grandmother Adelaide's strength was passed down to my daughter, Adelaide. Adelaide Grace was born on October 17th, 2015. Um, she shot out like she had a purpose in this world, and that she perhaps knew that she had limited time to utilize that purpose. I remember the postpartum nurse telling me that she was a little floppy, asking if she had been born breech. And this woman who had clearly seen, sees dozens of newborn babies a week, I immediately am just so defensive that how dare this woman, this professional postpartum nurse, insult my clearly perfect brand new baby girl. Um, but Adelaide, we would take her home and she narrowly avoided a failure to thrive diagnosis. And then at her 2-month pediatric checkup, we were referred to a neurologist who would diagnose her with low muscle tone. We went through a battery of tests, almost everything under the sun. Everything came back clear. Nothing of note, nothing treatable. And then she would have her first seizure when she was 7 months old. I still thought, okay, she has an epilepsy diagnosis. No big deal. We're going to give her a pill. It'll be fine. The low muscle tone, we'll figure that out. She's not going to be an athlete. You know what? Neither was I. We'll figure this out. It's going to be fine. And then at 9 months, she was diagnosed with infantile spasms, which is a particularly devastating form of pediatric epilepsy. Many children who experience infantile spasms can make a full recovery and go on to live a fairly typical life, albeit at a very strong risk of epilepsy returning. However, if there are any pre-existing conditions prior to the infantile spasms appearing, it is far less likely that that child will go on to lead any sort of typical neurotypical life. And that would be the case for Adelaide. Over the course of her 4-year life, we never had more than at most maybe 3 months of seizure freedom. But before I get too far into her life, and I also want to take a moment to introduce you to her, to get to know her beyond her list of diagnoses, because I think that's also so important. I want to set the stage a little bit, because I think what makes our experience notable, perhaps, I think the reason that I have been given the opportunity to share my daughter and our experience more than another person is because of what was happening during the duration of my daughter's life. The same week that she was initially diagnosed with epilepsy, when she was 7 months old, um, happened to be my last week working for Tom Colicchio's restaurant group. I was an event coordinator, sales director. I really enjoyed my job. I had done acting and modeling before, but it turns out that having a salary and health insurance and a bonus structure is really awesome, especially when your husband is also a performer and does not have security or stability in his job. It just so happens that that same week that was my last week working for Tom Colicchio's restaurant group, I was supposed to start with a new restaurant group the following week, a bigger and better job, director level position. I was so excited. This was great for my career, great for our family. Miguel happened to find out that he had been cast after 2 or 3 weeks of auditioning. One of those auditions, he had to leave Adelaide and I in the hospital to go into the city. He was cast as Alexander Hamilton in the Broadway musical. He would be the alternate. This was 2016, so this is right as Lin-Manuel Miranda is leaving the show. Miguel would go into the show for 1 month as the alternate, as the understudy, and then in the fall, and then at the end of the summer, he was set to start rehearsals with the Chicago company. And our family would move to Chicago just after Labor Day weekend, where he would open the Chicago production of Hamilton as the lead guy himself. And I he called me to tell me this news while I was out to dinner with my former colleagues, celebrating my new job and leaving the old job after 5 years. And um, I was dumbstruck. Miguel has described it as like, if you won the lottery, at first you would be like so freaking excited, right? But then it like sets in and you realize how much your life is about to change, and you start to become a little bit overwhelmed. And for me, him landing this role, which I was unbelievably excited for him, but that in conjunction with our daughter's diagnosis, and it took me all of maybe 30 minutes to understand that my career as I knew it was over. And um I it was one of my first major reckonings with a personal kind of ambiguous grief. And I'm going to get into more ambiguous grief later on, but it would take me about a year to grieve my career and that loss of identity that I would experience. And I felt so selfish while I was doing that, because how fortunate was I that I could leave my career to take care of my daughter when she needed me? How incredible that my husband was Hamilton on stage, and we were our family was bringing in more money than we ever had before, and more money than I had dreamed we could make before as, an artist and middle management in a hospitality group. Like, this was just, um, from the outside, our life, aside from having a sick child, looked glamorous and so lucky. And I really struggled with the difference between the way that our life looked on the outside versus what I was feeling on the inside. And so much of that was a result of me grieving the person that I had been, this career woman. Um, Adelaide and Hamilton would intertwine themselves throughout our entire run in Chicago. Miguel, I was actually in Chicago looking for our family's first home. Miguel was performing on Broadway. Uh, and that was when Adelaide received the infantile spasms diagnosis. I would rush home from Chicago, signing the lease on a rental from the airport to get back to her. I would plan our entire move from her bedside, where we would stay for a month after her initial diagnosis. Within 5 days of moving to Chicago, Adelaide was in an ambulance on the way to the hospital, because we discovered that even though I had been thickening her liquids, uh, she was still aspirating on her formula, and she developed a pneumonia. While we were in the hospital, the nurses had to force me to leave to go support Miguel, because he was throwing out the first pitch at a Chicago Cubs baseball game. And so I am texting with the nurses at the hospital while I'm watching my husband be announced as Hamilton, and the crowd is cheering, and we are on the hallowed grounds of Wrigley Field with the ivy walls. And I am thinking to myself, what is this life? Miguel is on the cover of Chicago Magazine, sort of cuddling up with Lin-Manuel, and people are texting us being like, this is amazing, he's on this cover. And I'm looking at the magazine as I'm walking out of the pharmacy holding her latest anti-seizure medication, passing this magazine rack with my husband on the cover, crossing my fingers that this medication actually works this time. He is singing the national anthem, Monday Night Football, Chicago Bears, Minnesota Vikings. It is so exciting. And I'm texting with our babysitter, who has to be a nurse, because she's letting me know Adelaide had a seizure. This is how long it was, and this is what it looked like. And this was sort of, Miguel would call it our rockets and parachutes. Being involved with Hamilton, it was wild. It was like holding onto a rocket in one hand, and you had no control. You're holding on for dear life. And in this other hand, we have our sick daughter. And in the beginning, I really thought that maybe she was holding us back. Maybe we weren't able to enjoy this full experience of Hamilton because we would get invited to these amazing parties. But in the back of my mind, I'm always worried about my daughter. I'm never fully present in any of these incredible experiences that we have been invited to partake in. And over the course of her life, what I realized is that she wasn't holding us back at all. She was grounding us for sure. She was keeping our feet on the ground, probably keeping our heads a rational size. Um, but she was bringing more meaning and purpose to our lives than I ever, ever could have even fathomed could be a part. We started advocating for various nonprofit organizations, including Cure Epilepsy, which is the largest non-governmental funder of epilepsy research in the world. Through that organization, we were able to meet other families. I became more in tune with the disability community and understanding the needs of the disability community, how even though the ADA had been passed years ago, how far we still had to come in that regard. I found a voice and I found a new purpose. The career that I had lost, all of a sudden, I was able to find this new purpose, not just in being my daughter's caregiver, but in being her advocate, in fighting for others and give it those who might not necessarily have a voice. Because all of a sudden, with my husband, I now found that we had a platform, and it was a really remarkable gift that Adelaide gave us. Now, I wish that she didn't have to suffer for us to have that gift. And that is a really complicated thought for me to balance, because she fulfilled my life in ways that I never could have. I didn't even know were possible, but it came at a great expense to her and to our entire family. Adelaide's condition, she would continue to add different symptoms. We never had an overarching diagnosis until after she died. And eventually it was determined when she was a little over 3 years old. We had back-to-back MRIs, and they could see that her brain was actually deteriorating. And whether we didn't know if it was the seizures, we didn't know if it was some genetic condition that just hadn't been discovered yet, because we had done extensive genetic testing at that point. But she was dying, and there was nothing we could do about it. And I still was very much in denial. I thought we would keep her comfortable and we would do everything that we could, but maybe we could still have years with her. We made it through that summer of 2019, and by September, it was very clear that she was significantly suffering, and there was nothing left for us to do. So we entered hospice, and Natalie passed away 5 days before her 4th birthday, in my arms, in her room, on October 12th, 2019. Before I get much further, I want to pause, because I understand that my journey, my story, can sometimes sound or feel extreme. We have this idea that child loss is like the holy grail of loss. And I think that comparative grief is BS. I think that no one wins at the grief Olympics. In fact, I started my book, Normal Broken, with a quote that I want to read for you now, because I think it's just so important before we get any further. You now have a better understanding of my story, but before I get into anything else, I just want to make sure that we are all on an even playing ground here, that no one is listening or walking into this thinking, my grief is different, my grief is worse, my grief is less, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't get us anywhere, and it doesn't benefit anybody. So Mark Twain said, "Nothing that grieves us can be called little. By the eternal laws of proportion, a child's loss of a doll and a king's loss of a crown are events of the same size." So whether you are showing up today, having lost a parent, a spouse, a friend, or a child, whether you are grieving your previous life, a career, a version of yourself, or a future life you had envisioned, whether you are grieving someone who is deeply alive but so very far away, your grief is valid. If you find this concept challenging because you believe that your loss pales in comparison to others, or conversely, you are growing ever more annoyed with those who you perceive as suffering from less than you are, then you absolutely need to read chapter 11 of my book called When Gratitude is a Struggle. But competitive grief, it doesn't do anyone any good. When people say to me that, child loss is this ultimate loss, I respond with saying, no one gave me a gold medal when my daughter died. There was no ticker tape parade. I don't get to wear any cool sweatshirt that says I won the grief Olympics. It doesn't matter. In fact, I think that when we rank grief in that way, we are instead putting our hand out to someone and saying, your grief is too much for me, and I don't have to engage with you because society says that that is one of the worst griefs possible. And I think by eliminating any hierarchy, that we can be better empathetic people, better listeners to one another. This becomes incredibly important when we're talking about ambiguous grief, which I think is unfortunately something as we enter 2025 that a lot of us can understand. The fires in LA, whether, unfortunately people did die, but it is the property damage that is affecting significantly more people. The loss of a home is not a death, but it is still grief. People have lost their businesses. They have lost their place of work. They have lost their community centers, their places of worship. This is all grief, and it needs to be treated as such. This is still loss. We still have to move through grief in the same way that we do when we feel like we've lost our identity, when we've lost a thing, or when we've lost a person. And so it's just so important to me when we lose the idea of the life that we thought we were going to have. I had to, before Adelaide ever died, I grieved this vision of what my family was going to look like, of what her life was going to look like. In fact, my mother is a therapist, was a therapist, she's retired now. But we were sitting by Adelaide's bedside a day before she died. And I remember asking my mother, do you think that because I have been grieving Adelaide for so long, that after she dies, my grief will count as time served? That I'll get out of grief jail a little bit sooner because I've done all of this pre-grieving? And my mother smiled gently at me and told me she was pretty sure it didn't work that way. And it was one of those moments where I really wished that my mother, who is almost always right, was not right. But she was. Pre-grieving, grieving the idea of a life that you thought you were going to have, none of that lessens the time that you are grieving after the fact. It is all different kinds of grief, and we need to move through it. We need to process it the same way that we do any other kind of grief. And so often we think that because it's not the loss of a person, because we're grieving an idea or we're grieving a thing, that it doesn't deserve the same time and healing space. And I just really think we need to emphasize that grief is grief is grief, and loss is loss is loss. And the best we can do is process as individuals and listen to someone else. After my daughter died, I felt broken. I felt broken doesn't cover it, irrevocably shattered. Like there was no way I could put the pieces together again. I once again lost my job. I felt like I had been forced into an early retirement from this job that I loved. There were so many things I was grieving beyond my daughter. I was grieving the nurses and the doctors that had become like family. I was grieving the hospital life that I had grown so accustomed to. I no longer felt I hadn't felt like I fit in with like medical normie families for quite some time, but even our traditional social circle, my typical son's friends, I felt like just a Debbie Downer, like Eeyore walking in. I would enter a room and it was, oh, there's Kelly, her daughter died. And no one knew how to talk to me. Even among my epilepsy and disability community, I they were welcoming and more understanding, but I no longer had the child that I felt like gave me entrance to that space. Even in my own family, I was significantly struggling to feel like I belonged because my husband and I were grieving so differently. We had during Adelaide's life, we had really grieved together. We were in sync. And I think because we were both so focused on what was best for Adelaide in that moment, because I was focused on her care, he was focused on her care, he was also focused on his work. We had these distractions a little bit from the grief. But when Adelaide died, I had no distractions. Miguel still had work to go to. He took 10 days off from the show and then he went back on stage and he got to escape into someone else's life. And people would always ask, how could you get up on stage? Spoiler alert for those who are unfamiliar with history or the musical, his son dies. And he has to grieve his son on stage. And Miguel would say, but it wasn't my son that died. It was Hamilton's. Yes, I had a child who died, but I'm not myself when I'm up there. I'm this character. And also he was 1,000 shows in by the time she had died. And at the end of the day, a job is a job, even if it's kind of sexy from the outside. I didn't have that luxury of slipping into another character or going back to a job because she had been my job. Miguel is also someone who prefers to grieve independently. For him, his grief is more internal. It is something that is private, that is not necessarily shared. He would grieve while he was walking our dog, picking up poop off the sidewalk. And he's like, he would tell me later that that's when he was crying. I experienced what I called grief exorcisms or werewolfing, where I had very little control over when my grief would erupt out of me, what triggers would hit me. And when they came, it was, let me just try and minimize the splatter. And I also needed my grief to be publicly seen. I needed my grief to be witnessed. Even if it was just someone sitting there holding my hand, I needed people to know that I was broken, that I was hurting. And I think that it was mostly because if they could witness my grief, then I knew that they weren't forgetting Adelaide. They knew that I was grieving her, and by witnessing my grief, I was not giving them permission to forget her. And so then that became twisted in this idea of I couldn't stop grieving because I was afraid that if I stopped grieving, I was giving people permission to also stop grieving and to move on and to forget my daughter in a way. It would actually take Miguel and I going to therapy in order for us to understand where the other person was coming from in their grief. It was there that Miguel admitted to me that he didn't feel like he had the right to grieve our daughter as much as I did because he hadn't been her primary caregiver, which was clearly, in my opinion, ridiculous, but that was something that he had to work through on his own. He also would give me space when I was grieving because that was something that he wanted. He didn't want me around when he was grieving. So when he saw me fall apart, he also gave me space, when in actuality, what I wanted was for him to sit with me. We came up with different ways for if I fell apart, I would tell Miguel, please, can you please come and sit with me for as long as you're able? Because it would be hard for him. He was also grieving. And that was something I had to bear in mind. This was, I could only ask from him up to his comfort level as he was also hurting. And in turn, I would ask him to tell me about his grief experience afterward, just so I would feel a little less alone in my grief. So one day, um, he comes downstairs and he gets some coffee and he tells me, I was regrouting the shower last night at like 11 or 11:30, and ADHD artist husband, they are just all over the place. So grouting the shower at 11:30 is totally rational. Um, and he told me that he started thinking about Adelaide while he was doing that. And he started crying. And that was that. But he told me about it, and I could hug him and we could share his grief after the fact when he was comfortable having that moment with me. And so we found ways to communicate our grief together. But there was another really integral piece that came from that. And that was, if I realized that we put a lot of pressure on our significant others to be the end all be all in our relationships, to fill every single one of our needs. And that is just irrational. There is no way that we can fill all of the needs of our romantic partner, or that we can expect them to fill all of ours. Because Adelaide and Hamilton just don't seem to be able to disconnect from one another. The week that Adelaide died, Miguel was actually offered to join the Broadway company of Hamilton. Hamilton in Chicago was closing in January. She died the October prior, and they were going to need a new Hamilton on Broadway starting at the end of February of 2020. And so Miguel accepted because, of course, but it forced our family to move from Chicago, where Adelaide had spent a majority of her life, back to the East Coast. We moved back to the exact same town we had been in, but it felt like another loss had been taken from me. Before I was ready, we were forced to leave this community that we loved, that had supported us. A very dear friend that I met there, who had really been my a supportive strength. She was the one who picked me up and got me out of the house when I needed to. She drove me to my psychiatry appointments. We had to leave all of these people who knew Adelaide best behind. So when the 1-year anniversary of Adelaide's death was coming up, I knew that Miguel was not going to be able to fill my emotional needs. And instead of getting mad at him, because if your partner can't fix the sink, there's a leak in the sink and your partner can't fix it, you don't get mad at them, you call a plumber, right? You don't blame them for that. You don't get angry because they can't fix that. You outsource it. And so that's what I decided to do with my grief. I outsourced it. I called that best friend from Chicago and I said, can you please come to Chicago, or can you please come to New Jersey? I need you this week, this anniversary of her death. I need you here because I need someone who can sit with me in the dark, who can hold my hand while I'm crying, and then who will make crazy, inappropriate jokes to get me out of it, and find those ways to remind me that there is still life to be lived. Because I knew that that wasn't something that my husband was going to be able to do. And I couldn't fault him for that because he was also grieving. I want to emphasize that while Miguel may not have been able to sit with me in my grief always, he never insinuated or asked me to move on faster. He never made me feel guilty for my grief. He never made me feel like my grief was too much. He allowed me to grieve in the way that I needed to, but he wasn't able to sit in it with me as much as I wanted him to. And it took time, but I realized that that was okay. I just had to find other people who could do that for me. And I think that that was one of the main things that probably saved our marriage in the end. A lot of shifts started happening for me around that 1 year mark after Adelaide passed away. Um, I really didn't want to heal. I felt like this 1 year mark was coming up and everyone was really throwing these healing vibes at me as if, 1 year has gone by and it was, now it was time for me to move on. My mother at this point started sending me all of these grief books, and many of them were brilliant. I would read them later when I was more ready and prepared to read them. But the problem was is that so many of them assumed that I wanted to heal, and I didn't want to. More accurately was that I didn't understand what healing meant. That was something I had to come to a little later on my own. So I could never even get into these grief books because there was an assumption of healing that I didn't agree with. Someone on Instagram, a follower, reached out to me and said, "Hey, I just saw this posting about a grief retreat that's happening not too far from where you live. I thought it might be interesting for you. It's a grief retreat for mothers who have lost children." And I thought, there is no way in hell I am ever going to something like that. And there might have been a couple of glasses of wine that evening. And then I woke up the next morning and there was an email in my inbox saying, "We are so excited to see you at the grief retreat next week." And I thought, oh, what did drunk Kelly do last night? Turns out drunk Kelly signed up for the grief retreat. Sober Kelly didn't remember. Um, I immediately figured that either it was going to be an amazing experience or it was going to make for some really great writing material. And it turned out to be both. At this grief retreat, the women, all of us had lost children. However, we had lost children at different ages from all sorts of different causes, whether it was anticipated or sudden. We all came from different backgrounds, but we had this one uniting thing in common. The leaders of the retreat were also mothers who had lost children. And there was, in that space, I started to appreciate how important it was to tell my story, how important it was to listen to other people tell their story. And on the last night that we were together, one of the leaders brings out a speaker and she starts playing 90s R&B and hip hop and pop music, and somewhere between like Belle Biv DeVoe and the Backstreet Boys, we are all up and we are singing and we are dancing. And I know for a fact that it was the first time for many of us that we had really let go of our inhibitions and allowed ourselves to just be in the moment because we weren't worried. We knew that none of us had forgotten our dead children. We knew that we were all still grieving, but in that space, our brokenness was normalized. Together, we were normal broken. And that was the moment that I realized that I am just not that special. I am special in all of the ways that Mr. Rogers told me. My individual story is unique to me, but the emotions and the way that it has impacted me is not special at all. I am not special that I find grocery stores extraordinarily difficult to go to. I am not special that I would walk through town and other people would be going about their regular Tuesday and I wanted to scream at them, "Don't you know that my daughter is dead? Can't you see that the world should stop?" But it hasn't stopped. It is still spinning and I don't know why it is spinning. And why are you laughing and smiling on this Tuesday when my daughter is gone? I realized that all of these vast experiences, all of these feelings, all of the emotions were not special to me. There is very few aspects of grief that are unique to any person aside from what it is that they are grieving. It is this universal experience. And that was what motivated me to start talking more about my grief, to be writing more about it. And then a few months after that, I guess almost 4 years ago to the day, President Biden was inaugurated. And the night before his inauguration, he gave a speech during a COVID-19 memorial event. And during that speech, he said, "To heal, we must remember." And I felt like someone had just hit me with a Mack truck, because I had never thought of healing that way. I now understood that I wasn't special in my grief. I now understood how I could feel normal in my brokenness. But regardless of your political affiliation, President Biden was someone who understood grief intimately. He lost an infant daughter and his wife suddenly in a car accident. He lost an adult son to prolonged brain cancer. This man understood grief, and he understood healing. And he was telling me that to heal, we must remember, not let go, not move on, not forget, but to remember. That was a kind of healing that I could get behind, that I could do. I could and always would remember my daughter. Healing was this action word. And in order to heal, we have to take action. We have to understand and process, what is it that is triggering our grief? What is it that's pushing our buttons, and why is it pushing our buttons? I came to understand that my reticence to enter grocery stores actually had little to do with grocery stores. It was actually standing in line. It was the waiting in line that would trigger my anxiety, because I had gotten so used to, during Adelaide's life, feeling like if I was waiting and I was trapped and I couldn't get out, I was always waiting for that phone call that said, "You have to come home, something is wrong." So it wasn't necessarily the grocery stores, it was that I had to wait in line in grocery stores, and that would trigger this panic inside of me. Even just knowing that I was going to have to wait in a line would trigger panic inside of me. Realizing what it was. So then when I'm in a line, I can remind myself, as difficult as it is, that there is no emergency. I am not in a fight or flight response. I am waiting in a line because I need to get my son milk, because we have to have breakfast and lunch and dinner, and I am providing. I am not in an emergency. And so processing what those triggers are, processing what it is that we are grieving, because we grieve so much more than a person or a home or a job or a life. There are so many little pieces within that, and we have to address each of those. We are processing. We are never healed. We are always healing. We are never grieved. We are always grieving. And that is something, once I realized that grief was never going to be something that was going to leave my life, I felt a peace come over me, because I often felt like grief was all that I had left of Adelaide. Grief was what kept me to her. I didn't want to let go of my grief, because that meant I was letting go of her. So knowing that I could still be on a healing journey and be grieving, that the two were not at odds, that they were in fact one and the same, because my grief was my love for her. So I could continue healing, I could continue grieving, and I could continue loving and remembering her and sharing her story to anyone who was willing to listen. Thank you to all of you who are willing to listen about my amazing, wonderful, beautiful daughter. My daughter who was more than her diagnoses, who hated traditional children's music but loved Frank Sinatra and jazz music, who would sit there and I would blow raspberries on her tummy and she would laugh, but the second her brother did it, she would stop and then she would slap him across the face. I mean, typical sibling relationship. Do not tell me that someone who is non-mobile and non-verbal cannot still get their point across, because I will tell you that my opinionated daughter had every way of communicating with us. My little girl that loved to be read to, who would dance in her stander wheelchair with her father, who loved motion, who loved movement, who would laugh the most when I would hold her in my arms and jump up and down. That was my daughter. That was my Adelaide. And that is who I love sharing with the world. Who looked up, we took her to Disney World, and we used to watch Doc McStuffins all the time at home. And we took her to a Disney Junior breakfast, and a giant Doc McStuffins is standing next to her. And she opened up her eyes wider than she had in months to take in this giant Doc McStuffins real life standing next to her. She, for better or worse, understood so much more than many people gave her credit for. And that is the child, that is the person that I want to remember and that I want other people to remember. 2 years after Adelaide passed away, we would receive a call from a social worker. And I'm not going to get into the details here, because that is not this next part is, I will share my part of this story, but I'm going to leave a little bit shady here. And that is on purpose. A social worker called to let our family know that there was a little girl who was in need of a new family. And would we be willing to take her in? And we said yes. And in November of 2021, we brought Anessa, she was 2.5 years old, into our home. And she is sunshine and rainbows and all that is good in the world. She brought laughter back into our house, just untainted, innocent laughter into our home. She gave my son a sister again. He got to be a big brother, one of his favorite jobs and roles in his life. And she allowed me to experience parenting a neurotypical daughter. And that came with so much joy. It also came with a lot of guilt. Something I really struggled with when Anessa turned 4, which was the age that Adelaide never quite reached. As my grief changed over the years, and I could feel, even though I am madly in love with Anessa, and she is absolutely wonderful. She is also a complete and total handful, um, as many little kids are. I found new ways that grief was coming into my life, because grief is constantly changing. It is not a constant. Just when you think you understand it, it morphs and changes, and it takes a new bend in the river. And this was a new way that grief was coming into my life, was as I saw these comparisons, and as I got to live the imagined life that I had dreamed of with Adelaide, but instead with Anessa. And it was hard at first, and I tried to use some of the tools that other people had told me about, instead of, thinking about, I used to do this, but now I'm doing this with Anessa, or I wanted this with. People tried to tell me to use, yes, and, or phrases like that, to use a comma, to, the both and kind of sentiments. And it just didn't seem strong enough for me. I needed stronger punctuation to separate my emotional experiences with my 2 children, because we probably never would have had Anessa come into our lives if Adelaide hadn't died. And there was no way that I could justify having this incredible experience being Anessa's mother and somehow justify that with losing Adelaide. I couldn't balance that budget sheet. So instead, I started looking for something stronger, and I found a period. I love Adelaide. I loved that she loved Frank Sinatra. I loved taking care of her. I hated that she was sick, but I loved being her advocate and caring for her. I am devastated that I don't get another day with her. Period. I am in love with my daughter, Anessa. She is sunshine and rainbows and dancing on tabletops and all things musical and creative and artistic. And I feel so grateful that I get to be her mom. Period. Both of these statements can exist in the same world, and one does not have to have anything to do with the other. They don't have to have a connection. They can exist separately. And that allowed me to live more in the moment with Anessa, to not feel that guilt that I was getting something or giving something to her that I couldn't get or give to Adelaide. And then sometimes life comes around and it just sort of slaps you in the face and shows you that sometimes your worlds are a little closer together than you think they are. I was going through a credenza in the entryway of our house and pulling things out, reorganizing. And Anessa was with me because she's never far from my side. We're sort of connected at the hip. And she's looking at everything that I'm pulling out, and she tries to open this green box. And she's asking me what's inside. And I tell her that it's a wind chime that someone had given to us when after Adelaide died, because she knows all about Adelaide. We have pictures of her all over the house. She's always asking about her and draws me pictures of ladybugs, which obviously is my symbol for Adelaide. She calls Adelaide her sister. I told her that on the wind chime, it says in memory of Adelaide Grace, that someone had given this to us, but I had just never gotten around to hanging it up. And I asked Anessa if she would like to hang it up with me. And that way, every time that it rang, we could think of Adelaide. She said, sure. So we go and we hang it up on our back porch. A few days later, we're walking home from preschool, coming up the back steps, and there's a slight breeze in the air. And I smile to myself, and Anessa bounds up the back steps and she spins around and looks at the wind chime and she says, hello, Adelaide. And then she starts walking toward the back door, turns around again and says, Mommy, Adelaide is ringing for us. Aren't you going to say hello to her? And my breath caught for a minute. And I looked at the wind chime and I said, hey, baby girl. And I realized in that moment that all of my grief and all of my joy and all of my children can coexist in the same space, on the same timeline, in my same heart. That we can all live this life together, because life will move forward whether we want it to or not. Because if it's not moving forward, if we're stopping ourselves from living, then what are we doing living this life anyway? So I have 3 children, Jackson, Adelaide, and Anessa, and they all coexist in my life and deep within my heart. And with that, I thank all of you so very much for listening to my talk. I completely lost track of time, but I think I'm doing okay. I will let you tell me, Susan. But
Let me unmute myself. Good Lord, that was just so incredibly moving. I'm going to just spotlight. Let's see if I can do this, Kelly, and spotlight myself as well. Yeah. Just so many things. What a beautiful story. And when you said that, but the part about introducing Anessa and how I know you said the social worker called, but what my mind heard was Adelaide called and she was sending you Anessa, and those things may not be connected at all, but and with the wind chime, that story is so beautiful.
I have to say, this just happened. So I have notes sort of that I go through when I give that talk that I'm like running through my head. I'm like, okay, you need to hit this, this, and this. But this just happened last weekend, this like 2 days ago. And so this happened yesterday. And so I have not had a chance to like really process this yet, but I feel compelled to share it right now. Um, one of the most challenging days, so that day that Adelaide met Doc McStuffins, we were at Hollywood Studios at Disney World. But the day started, we were waiting for Hollywood Studios to open, and Adelaide had a horrible seizure, a horrible 20-minute long, wretched seizure outside the happiest place on earth. And that dichotomy of that situation has always sort of just stayed with me. Yesterday, we took our family to Orlando. We were in town. We have a show that Miguel and I do, an evening with Kelly and Miguel, where we sort of talk about our journey together with Adelaide and with Hamilton, and he sings songs, and I give a little grief talk. And we were in town doing that show in Orlando, and we took our kids to Universal one day, and then we decided to do Hollywood Studios the next. And in my back of my head, I was always aware that I was going to have to walk by the place where Adelaide had had that seizure. And we walk by, and I sort of held my breath, and I remembered, and I was like, nope, I'm going to live in the moment. We are going to have this day with this family and with our children, and I love you, Adelaide. We're going to do this, and we're going to have fun. Anessa really wanted to meet Mickey and Minnie. And so we are in line to meet Mickey and Minnie. And on the cement wall next to the entrance to meet Mickey and Minnie, Anessa goes, "Mommy, look, it's a ladybug." And there was one lonely ladybug on the wall. And I don't know about signs or any of that, but I have decided that regardless of whether they are real or not, if they make you feel good, then that is a-okay with me. And so it just felt so good to have this moment where it was like, it was Anessa who saw her. And it was as if Adelaide was just saying, "It's okay, Mom, you're good. Enjoy this day. I'm still here with you." And at that moment where she's like going in to meet another I was like, we're okay. We're going to be okay.
In that journey through grief, I was talking actually earlier this morning with a friend of mine whose 98-year-old dad is dying, and she's been with him for the last 5 years, living in the house with him. And, we were just talking about the grief that's happening now for her in anticipation of him not being here in probably less than a week, maybe. And, something you had said about like asking your mom a question about, do you think like because of the anticipatory grief, it'll be less grief at the other end? And
Yeah.
we had that conversation this morning where I was like, yeah, honey, I don't think that's just,
I
um,
wish.
and yeah, but that the body leaves, but the love does not. And it's just sometimes like, so we're such a, our Western culture is just so about the tangible things. And I think like
Mm.
that is one of the hardest things I think for, like I'm thinking about grief, my grief problem, my beloved sort of died, and that like the love didn't go anywhere, but the
Right.
ability to express it sort of in a physical way, like, oh, I can hold your hand, or here you are, like that part was the part that it took me a while to sort of integrate, that love, that relationship continues even though the body isn't here. And if you say that to a lot of people, they think she's just lost her mind because her child died, or like her beloved died, but I think that's just such a true story. And it seems like it's really playing out in your family life
Yeah.
for, there's a couple of things that Bernadette, I'm going to come back to you. I just want to say, like, when you were talking about the way that you and Miguel grieve differently, I've been doing this work in end of life care for a long time, and a couple of years ago, had been tasked with writing a manual, and part of the manual was, of course, about grief. And I asked a friend of mine who's a grief. She was actually dying, but she was a very well-known grief person, and that was kind of her last hurrah. She really wanted to do this chapter because it was for people who were incarcerated. And when she sent it to me, I had been doing this work for such a long time and knew that people grieved in different ways, but there's actually language for it. Like an intuitive griever will
Yes.
grieve the way that you do, like And I think for women, this is sort of like how we're expected to grieve, because I'm not an intuitive griever, but the expectation, like crying, going to a support group, like letting our feelings out, like being surrounded by people that have a similar experience that can understand. And then there's instrumental grievers who will go out and regrout the shower in the middle of the night, or build a swing set in the backyard, or do any of these other things that is sort of an expression, like a physical expression of the grief, but the languaging and the crying, like that's a very private experience. And
Mhm.
to understand that, like I would always think about the way men grieve or the way women grieve, and like really looking at that language and like what she had written about that, I was like, how did I miss this all these years? Like these are actually just as much a part of our processing as my eyes are brown and their eyes are blue, or, it's just, and I think there's just so much misunderstanding about they're not supporting me because they're
Mhm.
grieving differently than I am. And so I'm so grateful that you talked about that. I think it's so hard, particularly with couples, that the expectation is the partner is going to be doing this the same way as I am. And when that's not happening, I think that's where it's like so many people, especially around child loss,
Yeah.
can't get through the grief, like get to the point in the grief process where they understand, we're both doing this and we're just doing it in different ways. So thank you
Yeah.
really for talking about that part. Bernadette, um, did you want to ask a question or share something? And please feel free to share. I'm looking, Bernadette, I was just looking to see where you were. I saw you a minute
I'm
ago. If you
here. I have
are okay,
unmuted. Is
you
that
down.
helpful?
Thank you.
Kelly, first of all, I want to thank you so very much for this story, for sharing Adelaide and your journey with us. I so appreciate hearing all the various types of grief that showed up in the journey, ambiguous and anticipatory. Um, that particular question that you asked about, I've been grieving all along. So, almost kind of that question you posed to your mom about, it just feels like there should be some in a bank. I just thought that was so real, and actually the whole entire journey. I do have a question. How old was your son when Adelaide died? And how did your son grieve? I'm just wondering, as parents dealing with your own grief around a child, with so much emphasis, of course, being on her because she's sick.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how did your son fare?
Um, that's an excellent question. Uh, he had his own arc and up and down grief journey parallel. So when he was 3 when Adelaide was born, he wasn't even yet 4 when she started doing long hospital stays. He was having sleepovers when he was in preschool because Miguel had to be at the theater. I would be in the hospital with Adelaide, and we didn't have a we don't have a familial support system in New Jersey, and we certainly didn't have one in Chicago. And so that was really difficult. Um, by the time he was 5, he had told me that he hated our family, that this wasn't fair. He was having a lot of negative emotions. I talked to him about how, we were all doing our best, that this wasn't mommy, daddy, or Adelaide's fault, that he shouldn't hate our family, but he could hate epilepsy. He needed somewhere to like focus this negative energy. He needed a bad guy. And so I gave him that bad guy. And then he is also um, grieves much more like my husband, and that everything is incredibly internal. And I think part of that is who he is. I think part of it is also that he is extraordinarily empathetic. This poor child gets all of my empathy and his father's need to like keep everything internal. And so I think he was often trying to protect me. He's incredibly intuitive. He would see a shift on my face and reach for my hand and be like, "Mommy, are you okay?" I quickly learned that as painful as it was, I wanted to be the person who was there for him. I wanted to be the person who he came to, who he felt comfortable with, who he could talk to about all of this, but I was not the person that he wanted. And so we found him a therapist pretty early on who he could talk to. And that also worked well because he called it his feelings doctor. So in a way, he had his own doctor in the same way that Adelaide had her doctors, and he got his special time. And so we would plan special dates with just, him and I, or him and his dad, or the three of us together. We couldn't tell him about the dates because Adelaide may get sick or they have to be in the hospital. And so they would be surprises, which was also kind of fun to prevent his disappointment. And then when she died, we were very honest with him when she entered hospice that she was dying. We had a social worker and a child life specialist who helped guide us through those conversations with him, because by no means do I think I was in any way an expert or capable of managing that. So we looked to outside forces to sort of help us with the right language. Um, and then I have to be honest, like, he loved his sister very much. He cuddled with her every morning. He could take care of her. He knew how to like flush her tubing and set up her feeding pump. But when she died, he got his parents back in a way. His life improved. And I needed to acknowledge that. And as much as I felt like mine fell apart, his life got easier and a little bit better. He still missed his sister, but he was 7 when she died, and life is just much simpler when you're 7. And he was still in therapy. He's sort of been in and out of therapy since then. He's 12 now. He's doing well, but I can see in him, he's going to, as he gets older, as his brain continues to develop, he's going to grieve her again and again as he gets a different understanding of what it is that he lost, of what my experience was. He still doesn't talk to me about her, very rarely. I'll show him pictures, or I will force the conversation. We created a memory box together before she died that he could like take some of her hair bows and different things that he wanted to keep to remember her by. We filled out a memory book together, so he could record, like I could help him record some of his memories because he was so young that I knew he would lose a lot of his memories of her. And we created photo albums, and every once in a while I'll go into his room and I'll find one of the photo albums out on his bed or the memory book on his bed, because it's something that he needs to do independently. I know that he misses her. I know that he grieves her, but it's something that he does alone. He's always going to be an incredibly empathetic human who uh, is open-minded, especially when it comes to disability and inclusion. And I admire that in him, and I'm grateful to his sister for teaching him those lessons. I And then, he gave a presentation at school and got 102% on epilepsy, and the specific genetic cause that we eventually found out was the result of all of her neurodegeneration. And so he's not completely avoidant. He like dips in when he feels like it, and on certain topics when he's comfortable. He stood up in front of his entire class and said that he had a sister who died. And I was like, it's just like he has a girlfriend. I can't even, he's 12. Whatever. They are a boy and a girl who are friends. And so when you are in 7th grade and you have a friend that is a girl, then you are in a relationship, I guess. We have a birthday party for Adelaide every year. And I just invite friends. Some of them knew her, some of them didn't. We release ladybugs, we sing happy birthday, and I usually have an activity for young kids, but it's just a time to like come together and celebrate her. And he invited his girlfriend this year, and I was like, okay, so he's like letting new people into this part of our family dynamic. And I'm sure that he's going to have lots of therapy in his future where he talks to the therapist about all of the things I did wrong along the way. And I will tell him I'm so sorry. I really did my best. But I do think that we got some of it right too. He's he's going to be affected by it. Who isn't, right? His bubble popped early. His innocence bubble. He is just very aware that anyone can die and that children die. And I think we try and protect our children so much.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are denied that protection for whatever reason. And I'm sorry that he was, but he's a really strong kid. I also I hate the term that like kids are resilient, because kids grow up to be adults and adults are a lot less resilient. And resilient kids still need therapy. That just means that you're stuffing it down. We'll see. It's a journey, and we take each new day as it comes and try and fill whatever needs he has. We're very mental health positive in our house. So he's currently decided that he doesn't want to have a therapist right now, but I'm always ready to find him someone to talk to when he decides that that's something that he wants, or force it if we get to a place where I feel like it's something that he needs. As his mother, he is only 12.
Thank you so much. I think you guys are doing incredible work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really beautiful. Goodness. Is there anybody that has a question or just something that they'd like to share? And if looking for the raise your hand icon at the bottom of the screen doesn't work, if you just unmute yourself, I can see that, and just give me a second so that I can ask you to begin speaking. And thank you, Teresa. Let me see if I can find you here. If you have your screen off, then that will be, if you have your screen on, I'd be able to drop you down here with Kelly, but if not, oh, there you are. Thank you, Teresa. And why don't you go ahead? There you go.
Quick question. I had lost my daughter through a very senseless, violent act, and recently lost my husband. And I'm finding when I meet new people and they ask me, are you married? And did you have, and how old are your children? And those normal conversations, which I think are so important. And I don't feel like people shouldn't ask the questions, but I'm finding I have a really hard time answering those questions, and the room just goes silent. And so advice that you have it would be really helpful, because I don't have an elevator speech, and I'm uncomfortable and other people are uncomfortable. So if you have anything to share on that, I would be very helpful.
Yeah. So first, I think that having the elevator speech is helpful. Having something that is like you feel comfortable saying, so that you can automatically go to that. The second piece that I will say, because I had the exact same problem. In fact, when we moved from Chicago back to New Jersey, any new neighbors that we met, if I saw them outside, I would run back inside, and then I would send my husband out, because I was like, okay, you have to meet them and tell them our story, because if I do it, there's going to be like a self-immolation. Like it's going to be bad. I eventually developed the elevator pitch, and then I still struggled. And it wasn't until, okay, not the, I just like lauded my own parenting, but this was not a good parenting moment. My son, it was, 1.5 years into the pandemic, and we had gone through most of the appropriate movies to watch, and now we're on to like the Godzilla movies. And I was like, let's watch this one. And he's like, no, mommy, I don't want to. And I was like, no, it's fine. The monsters aren't real. Like, let me just shame you into watching this movie together. And he said, no, mommy, I'm not scared of the monsters. I'm scared of the people's reaction to them. And that is when I realized, A, that my child is an emotional savant, and B, that I was not afraid of telling people about the loss of my daughter. What was terrifying was the people's response to them.
Yeah.
And so because at the end of the day, I love talking about Adelaide. there's nothing I want to talk about more than how incredible she was and how much she impacted my life and the joy she brought to other people when she met them. In fact, I feel sorry for new people that they don't get to meet her. That wasn't the issue. The issue is that people's response, and then I would feel bad for making them feel bad, and then they feel bad and I feel bad, and now what do we do? And I realized that their emotional response, their emotional baggage to me telling something that is very important to my life, that was something that I needed to leave with them and not let it affect me. This is my truth. This is what happened, and not really, I probably shouldn't curse, but not give a shit about how that made them feel. Because I would also, for a while, I would be like, well, my daughter passed away, but we're okay. And I was like, no, but we're not okay.
Right.
I'm not
Yeah,
gonna,
you're not broke.
I'm not gonna say that to make them feel better. So I'll be like, well, I have, my son is 12. I have Anessa, who is 5, and then Adelaide would be 9. But she passed away when she was 5. And then they look at me and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And I say, thank you. It really sucked. It still does. But I love her and she was incredible. And I sort of give them the opportunity to ask me about her, um, and sort of see where that goes. And then I can sort of get a gauge. It's almost like a litmus test with new people. I'm like, how do they respond to that? And how invested do I want to be in this new person? Is how well they can respond to that. I find that if I go into the conversation prepared and confident in the reality, yeah, it really sucks. Still does. It always will.
Mhm.
I still love her and she's amazing. That whole idea of it sucks, period. She was amazing. I'm so sorry you didn't get to meet her. Your loss. Um, or, how many children do you have? And moving the conversation along and treating it as it is this tragedy, not denying the tragedy of it, but also it's normal. This grief, this loss is so very normal. And it is their response to it that is not. And I don't want to normalize their response.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Teresa. There's a question up in the chat from Imena, and the question was, do you know of any resources for parents who have had child loss or for grieving children who can't afford to pay?
So in my experience,
Did you come across
because
any like?
yeah, I didn't use Helping Parents Heal. I found that a lot of these organizations have to be local organizations because therapy is medical treatment. So you really have to look in your local area. Um, we do have a service in our area of New Jersey, called, oh crap, and now I'm forgetting the name of it, that we have worked with. Unfortunately, because all of this happened and then we went into a pandemic, I didn't even look for any real services because nothing could be in person. Also because Jackson did not want to engage with me on this. And so we were sort of hand-tied by the pandemic and the timing of it all. For him, it was just like being with us and being able to like cuddle with us and have personal one-on-one time with us, I think was the best healing piece for him. But I do think that a lot of these agencies, they have to be local. They're often local nonprofits that can provide services and assistance. And a lot of times, the social workers at the schools are going to be aware of what programs are available locally. And if not there, I would look on local Facebook groups and not necessarily grief groups, like your local mom Facebook group. And uh, you will be able to find resources there for organizations in your area who are set up to help families.
There's also a national
Oh, yes,
organization.
Good Grief in New Jersey. Thank you, Bernadette. That's the one.
I was going to ask Bernadette where you were. I saw the snow in the background, and then I realized you could be almost anywhere in the United States right now.
Maplewood, New Jersey.
Wait, Bernadette.
Yeah.
You're local. You're down the
Sorry.
street from me.
Oh my goodness, that's wild. Um, the other organization, I don't know how active they are now, but I know friends have used them, is Compassionate Friends that were
Yes.
supporting, and they usually have local chapters.
Mhm.
How often they meet, I don't know, but sometimes they can connect you to other parents who are experiencing the loss of a child and offer some support or suggestions for children.
They also have sibling resources too.
Yeah.
I was able to go to their conference this past summer and speak there, and it was the services. They do an annual conference. It moves locations every year, and it's pretty remarkable um, the different resources that they provide in terms of getting specific about like how your child died and how old they were and if they're your only child or if where they are in the birth order. Like they can, because they are such a large organization, they can get pretty specific in helping you find other people who can relate very specifically.
There's some other places. I think it's I've seen them online, the Tears Foundation, where I think they offer some financial support for families navigating this kind of a loss. And then there's also the National Alliance for Grieving Children. Jimena, those are all like US based though, and I'm not sure um, in terms of, I think you're in Chile. There's also though, the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation is very connected with the Dougie Center, which is um, a Portland-based organization, but they have lots of resources online. And yeah, so I would suggest also, in addition to like parents groups, just to take a look online to see what's local to your community. Because we used to have a support group for volunteered at a place where we had children with life-limiting illness would come for a weekly support group from age 5 to 12 or 13. And we had a partner group for their siblings to get some support and just to be able to talk about what they were going through. And I think for some kids, that's really what they want. And other kids, that's like, oh, hell to the no. That is just like adults. Like that is the last thing I want to do is sit around and talk with a bunch of, strangers about this. So, um, anybody else with a question or want to share something? Yeah, I was thinking, one of the things you said towards the end is this idea I think this was such a strong response in me to this, you know, not wanting to heal grief because I felt like that was my connection to Bob. Like if I heal that, then we're done. And um, I really appreciate you talking about that. And I think it's a fairly common experience. Oh, that's great. But
Oh,
yeah,
thank you
it's just
again.
to keep talking about, this is something that I think that's so people that know that, oh, Kelly and Miguel's daughter died are so sometimes reluctant to bring that up. And I remember when my dad died, somebody said something like, well, you know, I wouldn't say anything to that. And my mother was like, do you think that I'm going to do you think I'm going to forget he died? And like suddenly you mentioned, and I'm like, oh my God, my husband died. What do you mean? Like that desire to want to share
Yes.
your loved one was your beloved daughter. And for
Yeah.
people to, listening to you, you just lit up when you started talking about Adelaide, to not have that opportunity to share her,
I mean, that
because
was one of the best things that I met someone new and I had like my spiel ready. I was less confident in delivering it. It was still pretty, maybe a year and a half, 2 years in. Um, and I mentioned Adelaide, and instead of freaking out, instead of backing away, she sat down next to me. I'm so sorry. She was like, tell me about her. What was she like? And to this day, that was the best response that I've ever gotten. asking about how or why she died or specifics about her illness or how am I doing? Please. Um, but wanting to know about her. I was like, yes, that is what you were supposed to say. That is like when people are like, I don't know what to say. You say, tell me about them. And if they don't want to talk about them, then they'll let you know, and that's okay. You didn't offend them by engaging on that. You're like you said, you were not like all of a sudden reminding them that this great loss of theirs is not here anymore. They are constantly thinking about it. But you're showing this sign that like you're willing to engage and that you care, and that is so meaningful.
100%. I can't think of a better note to end this conversation on, Kelly. Um, I want to just, from the bottom of my heart, just thank you so much for this. And I just for people, because people have been asking in the chat, this recording is going to get put up on the YouTube channel for the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation, and I will send that out to everybody that registered for this. And I'll send some resources like the Cure, the Epilepsy Foundation. I'll mention Compassionate Friends, and then links to how you can engage with Kelly through her Facebook page and her, Kelly, if you could send me all the social media stuff,
Yeah,
I'll put that in there
totally.
as well. And where you can get her beautiful book, Normal Book. And I will be turning off the recording in a moment. I'll be staying here for people that might want to have a conversation or just want to say something but didn't want it recorded. So Kelly, thank you from the bottom of my heart and from the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to turn the recording off now, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Kelly.